Is it Chloe? Is it who the actress character?
Maybe it's her that says it. I don't recall, but it was a
Well, no,
good
I,
line.
I mean, is it Chloe? Is the name of the actress character,
Yeah, the
isn't it?
actress character is Chloe, who plays Hera, and also plays Medea. And that was another thing I did by having the actress character play the two antagonistic females in Jason's
Ah,
life.
yes.
You
I
know,
see what you mean now about them being almost like mortal counterparts for the gods in the sense that Chloe would play both Medea and Hera.
yeah, and
But I suppose it doesn't also help to disprove the theory that you have a god complex, that you have your fictive analog playing Zeus as well, because
yeah,
you play your, or rather your fictive analog stands in for other gods in other plays that you've done, such as in the Arthur cycle, he plays Fire Eyes, you know, the
yeah.
sort of demiurgic god that Merlin worships.
I've read too much Pirandello, I guess.
Yeah, but I suppose this whole thing about sort of retelling myths. I mean, I suppose you could say that myths are supposed to be retold, or kind of that's the whole point
Yeah,
about myths. I mean,
yeah.
what do you think of that?
Well, obviously, I mean, you have this, and this is one of the things, though, that, and I mentioned the superhero characters. One of the things that I find wrong with major superhero comic strips is they, in a sense, uh, because we know, I think it's Siegel and Schuster created Superman,
Superman,
Bob
yeah.
Kane and Bill Finger created Batman, Stan
Mm,
Lee and Steve Ditko, I think, are what created Spider-Man. They have definite
Kirby
places
and
of
all that.
origins.
Yeah.
I don't think that they make good analogs for modern gods, because and that's what I did that whole book on the superhero with the set
Well,
50.
Jack Kirby would actually model his heroes off like Thor, right?
Yeah, but in there their reason dead for why Thor is there is that they're actually aliens, that the
Yeah.
Norse gods were actually aliens of some sort. So
Well, it's this whole chariot of the gods bullshit, isn't it?
yeah, basically. But the thing with retelling the myths is you sort of have to do it. But you, because we don't know where the myths come from, because myths come from the mists of time.
Mm.
It's better to retell them uh, over and over again. And it's sort of the eternal cycle of these myths. Ragnarok, and then come what's the great tree of life in Norse myth rises again.
Yggdrasil, yeah.
Yeah, Yggdrasil, yeah, Yggdrasil, whatever you want to call it. Or then whichever Hindu god it is, the flower all is coming from the navel to reset these things. The problem with a lot of the superhero characters is because we know that Superman was created in 38, Batman in 39, Spider-Man in 62 or 63, whenever it was. You get these constant things where every 15, 20 years they reset the thing. And so Peter Parker or Clark Kent, who probably would have been born on, what is it, Krypton in 1920 or whatever it would have been, is still young 100 years later, and that loses it. What they should do, if I was doing a comic book, not that I'm interested, but if I was ever to do a comic book, I'd say you have to let Batman age and then a new Batman come, or someone display it. That's more realistic for that, because you don't have the true mists of time. No one ever believed in Superman as a god. No one ever believed in Iron Man as a god. But they did believe in Hera. There were cults of Hera. I was even watching
Yeah.
an excellent little video about Aphrodite and how Aphrodite changed from Ishtar to Astarte to Aphrodite, and then how Aphrodite broke into three different goddesses, um,
Yeah.
and then became Venus.
Mm.
And so there, it's more organic. The belief system that people actually believed in is more organic than when you have a specific creator. And I think that's a major flaw of comic books today.
Well,
But
only if you believe, and there are some who genuinely do state, Grant Morrison is one of them, that these pop cultural figures are a kind of substitute for a kind of a modern mythology, modern mythopoetic structure. But I always feel that this is a bit of a that this is a bit of a that this is mistaken, or this is slightly wrong-headed.
For me, it's like someone playing with toy soldiers and trying to pretend they're George Patton. I mean, they're still toy soldiers. They're not the real thing.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, though, it becomes interesting to see how with various authors and poets, as it were, when they take these mythic structures, what happens in that adaptation? What happens in the retelling? They can be, I suppose, informative illustrations of sort of, you know, the place and time. I mean, so for instance, I mean, Ray Harryhausen with him. And it's almost like the Jason and the Argonaut story becomes almost like a magical toy theater, as it were, you know, this sort of like dreamlike toy theater. Whereas I suppose if I were to essentialize for a moment in your plays, it's almost like it becomes a didactic theater of competing value systems, as it were, you know, the modern and the ancient, the personal free will and sort of mythic fate, as it were. And you know, I think there's an interesting element in sort of like the travestying of the legend, sort of the deliberate sort of deforming of the legend, as it were, sort of like as you were saying, sort of this organic change that comes about with the retelling of myths over time. I suppose you know, I read a quote by C.S. Lewis a while ago where he said some myths don't have a story at all, and it seems to be that kind of that's really kind of that would almost be quite tantalizing to an author or a poet to, as it were, have a kind of clean slate, a kind of clean you know, space to come in and really kind of do what he wants to do with all these sort of figures and such. I mean,
it's a great missed opportunity. You know, if I think of I'm not an expert in Arthurian lore, but I mean, the closest thing in the last 30, 40 years would be Marion Zimmer Bradley's retake on King Arthur. And the few books that she does, I mean, it's pretty good. I mean, you know, I disagree with some of her portrayals and stuff, but like I you know, in there with Arthurian stuff, why do you need Tristram? Why do you need Lancelot when you've got Sir Gawain, who's for me a much more powerful, much more mythic, much more organic figure? Here, in the same way, you know, to me, Jason, if I talked about him being a more everyman character than Odysseus or Heracles or Theseus, because he is that everyman character, you should humanize him more. I wasn't going to try to push him to say, okay, Jason is in the same league with those other heroes. You know, one's a demigod in Heracles. Theseus technically would be a demigod, but he's not usually viewed as that. He's viewed as the more mortal half. He doesn't ascend like Heracles, where after Heracles dies and ascends and becomes a full-fledged god. And Odysseus, you know, has this great background, basically the equivalent of World War II 4,000 years ago. You know, he's the whole Trojan War was their world war at that time. And from what I know, there really was a Trojan War, and these myths came out of that. But Jason is basically an adventure story. And so how do we make Jason more interesting? How do we, you know, well, he's not super competent. He's not the brightest guy. But he's trying, and his failures are things that are more relatable than anything Heracles could do. You know, Heracles can change the course of a river, for God's sakes. He can hold up the whole firmament of heaven. You know.
Yeah, and in the last play, he becomes a quite brooding. I suppose in the last play and in the Medea play, Jason is quite a brooding figure, I suppose, or almost like an Oedipal kind of figure.
Well, he at some point he thinks he's insane. He thinks that Hera is a delusion, and she may very well be. I mean, I think I have a scene where the gods Zeus and Hera are worrying about, you know, human beings losing faith in them,
Yeah.
and that their existence depends on being believed in, which is something that's not unique to this play. There are other works off the top of my head I can't think of. I know there are other films and stuff where gods depend on. There's this cyclic thing where
Yes.
the essence of the
Even in
gods
those
depends
most
on belief.
recent sort of trashy film, I mean, they did a remake of Clash of the Titans recently,
Yeah,
and
oh,
that was
okay.
a big theme in that. Like,
Okay.
sort of the humans are losing faith and whatnot.
Okay. Yeah. But the end of the first play, and we'll take a break here because we're about 40 minutes in. The end of the first play, they're off for their adventure, and then basically plays 2 and 3 basically are the bulk of what's the Harryhausen film.
I suppose that this is you've made quite a few plays by now, and quite a few of these mythic plays. And the Jason cycle doesn't the Argonautilus, as you've named it, which I feel is actually a lovely name. But the Argonautilus doesn't strike me shall we say, you don't make any particular stylistic gains in this cycle. I would say you're not kind of doing any real creative pyrotechnics compared to some of those. I mean, I would even say in the Arthurian plays, we have a bit more kind of a term people like to use is sort of metatextual or intertextuality. I mean, there's not so much of that in these plays, and there are some kind of temporal displacements here and there. But it seems like you've gotten quite into the swing of these kind of mythic plays by now, that you're in a place almost, as it were, of kind of comfort. And I was just wondering, have you kind of settled into a kind of rhythm here with these things? Like, I know you do you're doing a whole bunch of different stuff in tandem, so you're doing your poets plays and whatnot at the same time, or rather intermittently, you'll work on one play and then another play. But it feels like you've gotten really into a rhythm here with making these plays. And I'm wondering, like, are you becoming a bit more too comfortable, perhaps?
Well, that's why I changed things up. The last couple of days, I've been working on my follow-up book on my cat, Kabiria, the one that I'm looking for you to, once I get it done, maybe do 8 or 10 pictures of drawings or whatnot. Yeah, you always have to go, and that's one of the reasons to go back and forth, to cross-pollinate. But I mean, there has to be a certain cohesion with if you're doing 5 plays. I can't have Jason, veering wildly in one play, unless the only way that could work is if one play was told, say, all the way from Acastus's point of view or Medea's point of view, and their Jason might be more monstrous to them. But since this is basically following Jason, and Jason is the central character, there has to be some consistency. Now, if you compare him to King Arthur, Jason is, I think, I have one of the scenes in one of the plays of the King Arthur plays where King Arthur is basically cool with Guinevere fucking around because that gives him the moral reason to fuck around, and he doesn't care. And Jason is again, he's more of an everyman. He worries about things. He worries about his reputation. He worries about initially doing right or whatnot. He seems to get more bitter and get more jaded as the play goes on, which is a natural progression since the first 3 plays are set over several months. Then the Medea play is set 10 or 12 years later, and then 20 or 30 years after that is the final play. So there has to be some kind of progression of the characters. But no, you never want to get too comfortable. I mean, I've got other plays for ideas, where I'm going to do more, eventually. I did so many plays that were based on my life early on, and people, you could get sick of them, and I got sort of sick of them too. And so now I'm doing, mythic plays. I still have some plays to do on historical figures. The poet plays are interesting to do because, for example, I've done 4 poet plays. 3 of them are rather nasty people: Stevens, Jeffers, and Edna St. Vincent Millay. The only the poet play that I've done with a likable lead character is the Hazel Hall play, and she's a paraplegic. So there's
a more sympathetic character, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I mean that like it feels that like where we are retreading, you know, if we're reading kind of your works chronologically at least, that we're retreading some familiar ground, especially in those conversations between father and sons, especially like kings and their sons. A lot of the conversations that we're reading are reminiscent of conversations from the plays with Sargon and the plays with who's the other one? Forgive me.
Cyrus.
Sargon and what was the other?
Cyrus.
Yeah, I mean, you know, this whole question of, you know, duty as it were, and what have you. But I suppose the one that really kind of stands out to me and was perhaps my favorite, and maybe even predictably, is the Medea one. If only like that's perhaps the most melodramatic, quote unquote, in that, you know, with the murder of infants and accusations and you know, like and what have you. I suppose the thing about that play to me that's quite striking is the kind of the heightened emotion that you're dealing with in those sort of scenes, and whereas in the other ones, in the other plays, there's a bit more of a cooler sensibility at work, even in all the scenes, really, a more kind of sense of detachedness. Whereas the Medea play does have more of those that kind of hot emotionality coming through, which you would expect.
That's in the latter half of that play. If you look at the beginning of that play, what I do is I hark back a little bit to the Dagonet character from the Arthurian plays. Dagonet was the court fool who ends up in love with Guinevere. Here,
the comedy of the assassins.
Right. Well, not only the comedy of the assassins, but the play opens up with a lengthy sort of Abbott and Costello routine between Jason the king, who's sort of off his rocker and if not actively insane, he's going senile, and one of his royal assistant Thaddeus, who he keeps mistaking as Theseus because it's one letter off. So you have this whole thing. No, I'm not Theseus. I'm Thaddeus. And they go back and forth, and he keeps, and even in the final play, he forgets the name of the character, and so the Jason is set up as more he's more a foolish character by that time, because he knows he's getting closer to his death. He knows from Hera, who he has shut out of his life and hasn't seen by that point. Hera plays a role in the first 3 plays, and then in the last 2 plays, she's sort of shut out before she has a final scene with Jason. And so he's sort of, all over the place. And the irony is, we always have in the background of these plays, and especially in the Medea play, and I highlight this far more than any of the other Medea plays, is that it seems like the Trojan War is only maybe a few months or a few years off, because there seem to be machinations on the outside that are forcing certain, in a sense, it's almost like a James Bond movie set, in ancient Greece, because, it turns out that King Creon, who in the original version is a good sort of righteous king, he seems good and righteous, offering his daughter, but he's really doing it so that he can then end up killing off his son-in-law Jason and taking over his throne. And so he becomes another manipulative father who's doing that. And what's her name? Medea, when she ends up killing him, she does it for the wrong reason, but she does the right thing, because he would have usurped her kingdom, his kingdom.
Yeah, well, there's a heavy sense of irony, I suppose, in the plot too. I mean, it reminds me of the Jeffers retelling of Medea, where I suppose Creon is and Jason are represented more or less as villains. I mean, although in the end, kind of what Medea does is quite kind of fantastically awful. Medea is sort of represented as kind of set upon and sympathetic ultimately. Whereas Jason isn't really, and Creon aren't really, although we figure out later that there are also these political machinations we're not aware of. Well, Jason is a sort of pathetic figure, more or less, and there's no real kind of overt malice. So there's more of the sense of kind of this ironical sort of displacement, where miscommunication, mishearing, as it were. People don't really know what's going on. That lack of perspective
Well,
is really the driving force.
we don't find out until play 5. Medea seemingly gets away with her oldest surviving son, Thessalus, who is named after this woman from Thessaly that is in Jason's mind from play 1. So throughout the whole play, Jason has these ideas fixe, if you will, about other women, whether it's Hera the goddess, whether it's this woman he doesn't know the name of. He names his son after. Very similar to the way Heracles is named after Hera in order to pacify her by Zeus. But in the main thing that I did in this play in regards to Medea is, like I said, it's a very sexist thing to make her the bad mother by killing her kids. So in order to get that around, I bring back Peleus, who in play 4, who hasn't been around since play 1, and he finds out that Medea's father, Aeetes, is the one who kills Acastus after Acastus betrays him. Acastus isn't lost. Acastus, we see at the end of play 3, is killed by Aeetes. So that sends, Peleus sends assassins to kill Aeetes. They fail. Aeetes finds out about it, sends assassins back to kill Peleus, but instead they come upon the 2 kids, kill the 2 sons of Jason and Medea, which basically that would send a mother off her rocker, presumably, especially a woman who has mystical powers. And it plays further in to Aeetes and Medea's why they have pleasure. Because I gloss over, I don't go in play 3 when they've stolen the golden fleece and they're fleeing. There's a whole sub story in the Argonautica and in various tellings about how Aeetes eventually sends his sons to go after Jason, and Medea ends up causing some trouble that kills one of her brothers and whatnot. But to me, that since I don't use those characters and we're dealing in a play where, you know, this would be different had I done it in a novel form. I could have gone into that. Here, to simplify it, we have the father and the daughter. The daughter has betrayed the country. The father is a despot. They're at loggerheads, and his actions, end up killing his own grandsons. And this then gives, I think, a far more powerful motivation for the hatred that Medea feels, and why she would kill Creon and his daughter Glauca, who's basically just, a nice piece of ass that's being offered as a way for Creon to take over the kingdom. And so, and because putting aside the death of her sons in the original, she kills them and Creon and Glauca, and by making them being killed by her and having the boys killed by her own father, it adds, I think, realism into the motivations. We don't know exactly how she escapes, but we do find out in the 5th play, Jason escapes basically by switching his crown with that of the dead Thaddeus. Thaddeus has basically taken an arrow or something for him, and he sneaks out the back way. So he sneaks out underground, very similar. Orpheus is mentioned in the first couple of plays. Orpheus appears. He has a few minor scenes, a few other Castor and Polydeucus are there, some other famous Greek characters. But he gets out by sneaking away and becoming part of the crowd as the Corinthians, Creon and Glaucus are from Corinth. They then sack Iolcus. And in the actual play Medea, in all the versions, Jason and Medea somehow end up in Corinth, and I think it was better to set it in Iolcus and have Creon and them come and sack that city. So politically, the 2 biggest changes in that 4th play are giving real motivation to Medea, and then giving the political machinations of this prelude to the Trojan War of having Creon and his daughter come in and basically fuck a lot of things up.